Hello, I'm Linda McIntosh from Studio ABC for my Facebook group, art group, and my YouTube channel are under the same name. Notice that the C is spelled S-E-E because we see the art. But most of my students call me Miss Mac. Our quick review includes elements of art, which are value, line, shape, form, texture, color, and space. We have covered so far in part 1 and 2, information about line, and just a tiny bit about space. Some positive and negative space. If you haven't seen part 1 and 2, you need to look in the description box below the video and click on the links to those videos so that you can catch up with where we are today. In the past, we have learned a little bit about how to use the elements of art, including line and space. The elements of art are used just like a toolbox for building a building, and you can make intelligent choices when you learn about the elements of art to create principles of design. Once we've finished studying about the elements of art, we'll go to the principles of design and study those. In our project for part 2, we did an implied line design, leaving negative space and creating positive space. We talked about actual line. Actual line is a real line. It is a line that you can actually see. So that's a really quick review of what we've already done in parts 1 and part 2. If you do not recall these, or I mentioned something that I went too fast and you didn't quite understand what I was saying here and don't remember it, you need to go back and review videos part 1 and part 2 for the elements of art. Today we'll continue with the element of art called space. It's one that we have already studied a bit, but there's a lot more to it than just negative and positive space. We're going to see how to divide space to make your pictures look the way you want them to look, to give them depth so that they don't look flat. Okay, so I like for you to know what we're going to do at the end of the video so that you'll be thinking about that while you're watching the video and really learning something towards that final product that you're going to make. In our study of space, in part 3, we're going to learn about background, middle ground, and foreground, about landscapes, cityscapes, and seascapes. We will touch on 1 and 2 point perspective, but I don't want you to dwell on that too much because we'll go back to that and have some more lessons on it. But I do want you to know the difference between linear and aerial perspective. Aerial perspective is also called atmospheric perspective, and I might use either one of those terms, so I want you to know that it means the same thing. Our assignment at the end of this video will be to use what you learned about space and perspective to plan a contour, landscape, seascape, or cityscape drawing. Remember, contour lines are the outside edges, and we'll do that and then we'll color it in later. I always like to have you do some vocabulary words so that you'll know what I'm talking about when we get into the video. So here is where you would pause your video and copy the words in your art vocabulary section of your art journal. And when you are finished, come back and start the video again. Let's start by talking about foreground, middle ground, and background. When you look at this famous painting by Thomas Cole, do you feel like it's right there in front of you, almost in your lap, or do you feel like you can look in it far away? That's what depth is. If you said far away, you can look into the background. That's what depth and perspective is about. In most pictures, you're going to find that the background, or the part that's the highest up on your paper, will form the background. That would be the part that is furthest away from you. And then next, coming forward, you would see middle ground, and this is where you quite often see the focal point. A lot of people think it's in the foreground, but it can be, but quite often it's in the middle ground. And as you come forward, the foreground doesn't have to cover every single bit of the bottom. It might just be some tree leaves that are closer to you, or a bush. Let's look at this photograph of plants that form this little pathway. Can you identify where the background, the middle ground, and the foreground are? Take a close look and try to do that just with the little bit that we talked about in the other pictures. Okay, this shows you background is where everything seems to be covered with fog. Middle ground is where the photo begins to look a little bit hazy. And the area at the bottom and the sides and even up over the top a little bit is the foreground. Foreground, middle ground, and background don't have to be the same size every time or the same shape. In every picture it's different. Space in the diagram above is broken into 3 sections. And I bet you can already name them without even reading. They are background, midground, and foreground. Please notice that in the midground, there are some buildings that are hazy in there. But this was only meant to be a diagram, not a really crisp photograph or a really crisp painting. Mostly in that midground area, again, at the buildings. That's probably the most important part of the painting. So the background and the foreground kind of frame that area. And it's a little bit less crisp than the foreground would be, but it's not as hazy as the background is. We get into something called linear and atmospheric, which is also called aerial, perspective when we're looking at the fuzziness or the way it goes back and seems to get less clear, less detail. And I want you to notice in this diagram that just because an object's closest to you doesn't make it the most important thing. Again, midground is usually where your focal point begins and ends. If you don't remember what a focal point is, I don't like to call it center of interest because people think it needs to be in the center like a bullseye. A focal point's what you need to focus on. Here's another diagram of background, middle ground, and foreground. This is labeled atmospheric perspective, but we know that atmospheric and aerial perspective are the same thing. What do you see in the background? Do you see mountains and sky? And as you come forward, there's a grassy area and some darker mountains in front of those back mountains. Right in the very foreground are some flowers. And if an artist were making something based on this diagram, probably the flowers would be your focal point, and they are in the foreground. So when you're planning your paintings or drawings, you need to plan to make your focal point what you want the viewer to see, what you want to call attention to. You need to make it either in the foreground or the middle ground, not in the background. It makes no difference whether you're doing a landscape, a seascape, or a cityscape. The foreground, middle ground, and background information that you create, it can still be used where you use aerial perspective. Because in the background of this picture, you see that it's very hazy. And when you get to the foreground, to the rocks, they're very crisp. Lots of detail. And I think in this particular one, the rocks, the foreground and the middle ground create your center of interest. What's the center of interest called besides center of interest? It's called focal point. We're covering a lot, but I told you I'd bring Thomas Cole's picture back. And the reason I did is we just mentioned aerial perspective, which is also called atmospheric perspective. And that means that when you look way back into the picture, things become less distinct, less detailed, and if the sky is blue, it becomes more blue. If the sky is gray, it becomes more of a gray color. Whatever objects there are. You might try, if you're driving someplace with, and you can see different layers of hills behind each other or mountains behind each other, notice the colors of those, because the further you go back, the more of the atmosphere mixes with it, and the more color change there will be. What color is the sky? Everybody usually says blue. Sometimes it's gray. But usually people say, oh, the sky is blue. Well, we don't realize it, but anytime, all the air around us is blue, but it's so transparent. It takes a lot of air for you to be able to see that blue. And so you're looking through a great distance when you see the atmosphere of the earth and see the blue sky. It's reflected light that shows blue. So the further away you get, the more that blue mixes with the color that's on whatever is far away. Take a look at that when you're driving sometime. It's kind of fascinating. Okay, so things far, far away will be less distinct. They're going to have softer edges. You might see right in the middle of the picture where those clouds are real soft against the mountains. And the mountains aren't very distinct. But when you come to the foreground where the tree is, you get a lot of detail. You see the sticks and the leaves and things that you couldn't see even in the middle ground if you look over to the right by that loop of water. You only see just a little hint of some little dots of things. You don't see each leaf back there. And that will help you make a more mature painting. Here's another famous painting by Camille Corot, Reflections of Montfontaine. It was done just about the same time that Thomas Cole did his. And this was the way they painted then. They used this type of colors in landscapes, and they tried to make everything very realistic, whereas sometimes today we kind of like our abstracts better. It depends on, kind of what you like, your own personality. But anyway, take a look at this. Can you identify background, middle ground, and what's in the foreground? And think about where these are placed. Background will be higher on the page, middle ground will be somewhere in the middle, and foreground will be closest to you. Where do you think the focal point is in this one? Is it in middle ground or is it in foreground? Is this what you saw whenever I asked you about background, middle ground, and foreground? I think probably the most important part of this particular painting is the area in the foreground. I think that's your focal point. So sometimes it can be in the foreground. Now I want you to remember that when the atmosphere mixes and makes things hazier as they go away, that's called atmospheric perspective, or it's called aerial perspective. Remember that. Did you know that we're kind of magicians when we become artists? We are, because we make people look way deep into the paper, especially when we use perspective. And it's the way you arrange your space that causes perspective. And there's an infinite number of ways to arrange this space to get that perspective. This drawing shows the vanishing point on the horizon. I put a little red dot right there at the end of the highway. Maybe you can see that. It is a one-point linear perspective, not aerial perspective this time. We don't have any haziness or fading out in the atmosphere. It's linear because everything goes towards one point like a line. Linear and line are related words. Okay, as I said, there's no hazy stuff that gets in the way of this type of perspective, but you can combine both together, and that really makes for interesting depth. Now, this is called a one-point perspective, and I'll show you why when we get to 2 points. Where the red dot is the vanishing point, and you need to study this. This is called a cityscape because it's got buildings and that sort of thing in the cityscape. Landscapes have trees and flowers, and it can have buildings too, but it's mostly nature. And not only does every line go back towards the vanishing point, but everything seems to get closer together and smaller as it goes towards the vanishing point. So artists use perspective to arrange their space, and we'll come back to this later, so don't worry too much about this yet. For now, I just want you to be aware of it so that you can start observing this kind of thing when you're outdoors in nature or driving through the countryside. Notice the red dot that I placed on this picture of the railroad tracks. It looks like several railroad tracks side by side, but they all look like they vanish, and so do the electric wires, and so do the trees. They continue to go along the side and vanish. And so this is one-point perspective because you're looking in one direction in the distance. But what happens in a cityscape if a person is standing, if the viewer is standing at the corner looking down two different roads? Well, that's where we get two-point perspective. I just want you to be aware that there is more than one point in some pictures, and you might start observing this in nature whenever you're outdoors also. So don't worry about this too much. I just wanted to introduce you to it. Since we're going to come back to linear perspective later, I want to really emphasize right now the aerial perspective, the atmospheric perspective. So I'm going to put a few pictures on here just for you to observe, to see what that looks like in different people's paintings or drawings. And some of this is student work and some of it is professional work. So you look at how they created the depth in their pictures. So these are some examples to give you some inspiration. I want you not to copy this work, but to come up with your own ideas. Just get an idea of how they created the space by overlapping and by using that haziness in the background, making things smaller as they go back in the picture. Observe those kinds of things. And if you need to go run through this, back the video up and look at these pictures again. Okay, so your assignment is going to be elements of art, a space composition, a perspective composition. You're going to use plain white paper from your mixed media pad. You'll need a pencil and you'll need crayons or colored pencils. Actually, I'm going to ask you to mix the colors. So let's look at the procedure. Use your pencil to draw a landscape, cityscape, or seascape that will demonstrate your knowledge of foreground, middle ground, and background. So you need all three to include all three of those things. Then you're going to color your composition with colored pencil or crayon, and you're going to use crisp colors in the foreground, and then as you go back, they'll get hazier. You can actually mix crayon colors together, and you can actually mix pencil colors together. I'm not so sure that pencil and colored pencil and crayon will mix that well together. It's going to depend on what brand you bought. So you might stay away from that, but you can mix within the same type of materials. Don't make your first drawing dark because it'll be hard to get rid of those pencil lines. A lot of times when I'm going to use colored pencils, I use a colored pencil to draw with that's going to go into the particular, that's going to go well with the colors that I'm going to use. So I'm going to be grading this looking for what you learned from this video and how you applied it. So anything that I mentioned in the video, if you know how to do linear perspective, you can add that to your drawing. But mostly I'm looking for aerial perspective. But I'm also looking for that foreground, middle ground, and background. So those four items, aerial perspective, foreground, middle ground, background, you need to dwell on that. Can't wait to see what you do. Give this video a thumbs up. It helps the channel. And thank you for watching.